It started like any ordinary morning. A successful businessman left his apartment to grab some breakfast, not knowing that someone was watching his every move. The city was alive with its usual noise and energy. But in moments, everything shifted. Suddenly, the sound of gunshots cut through the air, 3 quick blasts in broad daylight. People stopped in their tracks, stunned by the sudden violence. The man collapsed just a few steps away from safety, and panic spread through the neighborhood. Who fired the shots? And why was he the one in their sights? Behind the carefully planned attack was a tangled story of money, betrayal, and long-hidden secrets that would take years to come to light. Let's get into today's story. Barbara Cogan was born in 1943 in New Jersey, the second daughter of a well-to-do Jewish family. Her father ran a successful business, so Barbara grew up in comfort and privilege. From a young age, she was drawn to elegance and the glamorous side of life. Friends and family remembered her as stylish, confident, and always perfectly dressed. She had a love for designer clothes and glittering jewelry, and she carried herself with poise. Barbara attended Hunter College in Manhattan, where she quickly made a name for herself as bright, outgoing, and very social. Beneath her charm, she had a strong drive to succeed and be recognized. One of her earliest passions was dance. In high school, she convinced her parents to support her lessons. And by 16, she had already won a state dance competition in New Jersey. Her prize was a chance to appear in a music video for Capitol Records, a major American label. The video never ended up happening, but the experience only fueled her determination to perform. During her college years, Barbara began appearing on Broadway stages, becoming part of New York's lively theater world. She also nurtured a love of art, majoring in art history and spending much of her free time painting. Friends described her as intelligent, ambitious, and magnetic, someone who naturally drew people in. Barbara had no shortage of admirers, but she was picky. She wanted a partner who was just as driven and successful as she hoped to be. In 1961, she met that person. After one of her performances, a young man named George Cogan approached her. Like Barbara, he loved the arts. But what really stood out was his confidence and determination. George was studying business in New York and carried himself like someone who had big plans for the future. Their connection was instant. George began courting her with dinners at fancy restaurants and thoughtful gifts, which quickly caught her attention. Barbara assumed his background was similar to hers, wealthy, but not extraordinary. In truth, George came from an even more privileged world. His family was one of the richest in Puerto Rico, having built a massive fortune through a successful chain of department stores. By the 1960s, the Cogan family's wealth was estimated at around $40 million, an incredible sum at the time. George had been born in Puerto Rico on September 25, 1941, into a powerful and ambitious dynasty, far from the glittering stages of Manhattan where their paths eventually crossed. George Cogan came from a family that had built its fortune over generations. His grandfather, Salomon Cogan, left Minsk to start a new life and ended up creating a thriving retail business in Puerto Rico. George's father took that foundation and expanded it even further, investing heavily in real estate and securing their place among the island's most powerful families. George grew up surrounded by privilege, but his childhood wasn't perfect. His mother was known to favor his older brother, often putting George down, which left lasting scars on his confidence. Still, he was determined to prove himself. In the 1960s, he moved to Manhattan to attend New York University's business school, intent on following in his father's footsteps. Meeting Barbara wasn't just a romantic turning point. It was the start of a partnership between two driven people. Both carried heavy family expectations, and both shared ambitious dreams of success, elegance, and recognition. In 1964, 3 years after their first encounter, Barbara and George got married. For George, the timing had practical advantages. 2. Marriage exempted him from military service, which he had already managed to postpone thanks to his education. Some later speculated that this was his true motivation for marrying quickly, though only George knew his real reasons. After the wedding, Barbara moved to Puerto Rico with him. There, she was introduced to George's extended family and their impressive collection of properties. As part of their new life, the couple was given a hotel to manage and a stylish apartment to live in. For Barbara, who was used to comfort but had never experienced such luxury, It was like stepping into another world. They embraced their new life eagerly. They wanted to build a family. But when pregnancy didn't come as expected, they turned to adoption. In 1966, they adopted their first son, Scott. Just weeks later, Barbara discovered she was pregnant. And 9 months after that, their second son, William, was born. Barbara took great pride in shaping their family's image. She became well known for her fashion sense and reportedly spent up to $100,000 a year on her wardrobe, an enormous sum at the time. In their early years as parents, her attention was on raising the boys, but as they grew older, she began to take a more active role in George's business ventures. She helped manage the hotel and carved out her own place in their expanding enterprises. To outsiders, the Cogans' life looked enviable. They went horseback riding, spent weekends at the stables, and threw lavish parties that Barbara hosted with flair. Together, they invested in property, opened a jewelry store, and expanded their business interests. George had achieved his goal of becoming a successful businessman like his father, while Barbara thrived in the elegant, high society lifestyle she adored. Their success even drew Barbara's parents and sister to Puerto Rico, where they launched businesses of their own, further strengthening the family's social and financial influence. Barbara became a prominent figure in local society, admired for her impeccable style and presence. But after 25 years of marriage, change was in the air. In 1987, Barbara and George decided to leave behind their established life in Puerto Rico and start fresh in New York City. George saw potential in Manhattan's booming real estate and antiques markets, while Barbara dreamed of finally stepping fully into the glamorous social circles she'd always envisioned. They arrived in New York with wealth and status intact. Yet behind the polished facade, their marriage was faltering. Rumors circulated that Barbara had pushed for the move, hoping to rekindle a relationship that had grown distant. Friends claimed they no longer shared a bedroom, and Barbara often criticized George's looks. Even George admitted that the passion between them had long faded. To some who knew them, Barbara and George's marriage had always seemed more practical than passionate, built on shared ambition, appearances, and convenience rather than deep love. Still, no matter what rumors floated around, they managed to maintain a polished public image. The Cogans were viewed as a sophisticated couple who avoided public arguments and scandal. Once they settled in New York, the pair launched a new business, a high-end store specializing in antiques, fine art, and jewelry. Barbara, whose love for art went back to her youth, threw herself into the project. She carefully picked the location, designed the layout, and made sure every detail reflected the refined image she wanted for herself and the brand. She also handpicked the staff. Among the new hires was a young woman named Mary Louise Hawkins. Coming from a wealthy family herself, Mary Louise was bright, charming, and much younger than the Cogans, but she quickly earned their trust. Her role was to manage the store's marketing and protect its reputation. She made an excellent impression from the start. It was Barbara who introduced her to George during the store's glittering grand opening in November 1988. George was 47. Mary Louise was 28. That night, George mentioned to Barbara that Mary Louise was stunning. Barbara laughed it off and even joked about it with Mary Louise. But after a few drinks, George repeated the comment, this time with more sincerity. From then on, their paths began crossing more often, usually under the pretense of business. Mary Louise dedicated herself to improving the store's image, which wasn't always easy. Employees had long complained that Barbara could be demanding and even harsh at times, and those complaints occasionally reached customers. Mary Louise often had to step in to smooth things over and repair the damage. George started appearing at the store more frequently, supposedly to keep an eye on operations. In reality, he was finding reasons to spend time with Mary Louise. He created projects that kept her working late and then took her out to dinner afterward. Over long conversations, George opened up about his unhappy marriage. He confided that he no longer felt any real love for Barbara, that their relationship had become hollow and intimacy was long gone. Barbara, however, showed no sign that she suspected anything. She adored her husband and genuinely liked Mary Louise, even trying to set her up with her eldest son at one point. Meanwhile, George's attraction to Mary Louise deepened quickly. Before long, He planned a trip to Puerto Rico under the guise of business. But the real purpose was far more personal. By that point, their relationship had crossed the line. George and Mary Louise had become lovers. By the end of 1988, George confronted Barbara directly. He told her he wanted to be with Mary Louise and that he wanted a divorce. The news devastated Barbara, who had seen no warning signs. Practically overnight, George left the family home to live with his mistress, while Barbara stayed behind with their younger son. Heartbroken and blindsided, George and Mary Louise began traveling the world together, India, Florida, and other destinations, and he showered her with expensive gifts. Barbara, still tied to the family's finances, saw every transaction and knew exactly where they were and how much he was spending. The betrayal hit her on two levels, emotional and financial, and the anger it created would linger for years to come. Barbara didn't take the betrayal quietly. She decided to strike back. She contacted Mary Louise's employer, a well-respected company, and voiced her outrage. Not long after, Mary Louise was dismissed from her job. But despite this small act of revenge, Barbara found little comfort in it. The damage had already been done. By this time, George was a millionaire, and Mary Louise no longer needed to work to live comfortably. Barbara, meanwhile, turned her energy toward the divorce. In 1989, she officially filed, citing George's affair and backing her claims with a collection of evidence. Bank statements, photographs, and records of the lavish gifts he'd showered on his mistress. Barbara set her sights high. She requested significant financial support, $5,000 a week in alimony, $100,000 to cover legal fees, $25,000 for accountants, and close to $1 million for her share of their property and businesses. She had top-tier lawyers on her side, which made her case appear strong. But George had money, connections, and an equally aggressive legal team. Her first set of demands was quickly denied, and her second attempt failed too. Things only got worse when George suddenly cut her off from their joint accounts. Despite the divorce still being unresolved, he also began hiding parts of his fortune, reporting a much smaller net worth than he actually had. Barbara knew he was lying, but she didn't have the proof to expose it. The legal fight grew nastier when George accused her of stealing jewelry from their home, the same jewelry he'd originally bought for her. With no access to funds, Barbara had to rely on her mother to help cover her mounting legal bills. While she struggled, George and Mary Louise traveled the world in luxury, seemingly untouched by the turmoil. Barbara could only watch from afar as her anger and frustration built month after month. Then, on the morning of October 23, 1990, everything changed. George and Mary Louise were living together in her Manhattan apartment. Around 9:30 a.m., George left to buy breakfast. He walked to a nearby market, made his purchase, and started heading back. He didn't realize someone was following him. Just steps away from the building, 3 sharp gunshots rang out. George had no time to react. Witnesses saw the attack unfold in broad daylight. The gunman escaped as George collapsed on the sidewalk, bleeding. A neighbor rushed to help while the concierge called for an ambulance. George was taken to the hospital in critical condition. Barbara, still legally his wife, was notified. She hesitated over whether to visit, knowing Mary Louise would be there, and ultimately decided not to go. Instead, she contacted her relatives. Hours later, at around 4 p.m., the phone rang again. George had died from his injuries. The aftermath revealed just how fractured the Cogan family had become. George's parents, long uncomfortable with the scandal surrounding his personal life, didn't attend the funeral, and their absence was deeply felt. Among the mourners was his 12-year-old niece, Taryn Cogan, who later remembered the day vividly. The heavy, whispering crowd, the sorrow, and one unforgettable image, Barbara, occasionally smirking during the service. Detectives launched an immediate investigation. It was obvious from the start that this was no random attack. George had been hit 3 times, each bullet striking near his heart. The precision suggested a planned killing, possibly even a professional hit. Witnesses described the shooter as tall, calm, and deliberate, someone who looked like they knew exactly what they were doing. Investigators initially examined George's business history. Over the years, he'd taken out large loans to grow his ventures. While he had always repaid them, he still had debts at the time of his death. Could this have been a financially motivated killing? That theory lingered. But detectives soon turned their focus to something more personal: the bitter divorce. Barbara was still George's legal wife, and she was also the beneficiary of his $4.2 million life insurance policy. That fact alone raised serious suspicions. However, Barbara had an alibi. She was at the hair salon at the exact time George was shot. Barbara Cogan was never accused of pulling the trigger herself, but suspicion around her motives grew quickly. Not long after George's death, she withdrew $2 million from his life insurance policy. The remaining amount was frozen as investigators continued their work. In the months that followed, Barbara presented herself as the grieving widow, even appearing at the funeral, dressed in custom designer clothes, made for the occasion. But over time, the case grew cold. By 1996, no one had been arrested, and Barbara eventually received the second half of the insurance payout. Despite the fortune she inherited, Barbara burned through the money at a startling pace. Within just a few years, the wealth was gone, and she even filed for bankruptcy. Meanwhile, detectives kept the case open. Their investigation eventually led them to an unsettling conclusion. George had led a fairly clean business life, and he had few genuine enemies. The one person with both motive and financial benefit was Barbara. One key discovery pushed suspicion even further. Just a week before George's murder, Barbara had learned that she was still listed as the beneficiary on his $4.2 million life insurance policy. That knowledge provided a clear motive. For nearly 2 decades, the case sat unsolved until a shocking breakthrough came in 2008. Barbara's former divorce lawyer, Manuel Martinez, confessed that he had helped arrange George's murder by hiring a hitman. The price for the killing was $40,000. Investigators followed the trail. Bank records, phone logs, and witness testimony placed Barbara directly at the center of the conspiracy. She denied any involvement, but the evidence was overwhelming. In 2010, Barbara Cogan pleaded guilty to manslaughter and related charges. She received a sentence of 12 to 36 years in prison, ultimately serving 12 years before being released on parole in 2020 at the age of 77. Martinez was also convicted. He had even traveled with Barbara to Puerto Rico to gather the funds for the hit. And in 2008, he was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The consequences for Barbara's family were devastating. Her 2 sons, Scott and William, were forced to face the painful truth that their mother had orchestrated their father's murder. At her sentencing, Scott gave a tearful statement, expressing both his love for his parents and the deep pain caused by his mother's betrayal. Since Barbara's release, neither son has spoken publicly or reconciled with her. Their silence speaks volumes about a family bond broken beyond repair. Mary Louise Hawkins, George's mistress, also faced lasting fallout. In 1993, she left the United States for Europe, hoping to escape the media glare and threats she had received after the murder. She built a new life there, marrying and changing her name to protect her identity. For decades, she stayed out of the public eye. But in 2020, during Barbara's parole hearings, she spoke openly for the first time in years. Her words were fierce and unfiltered. She called Barbara an animal and condemned her manipulative behavior, expressing outrage that she was being released. The murder of George Cogan left deep scars that reached far beyond the crime itself. It shattered a family, tainted a fortune, and transformed what once seemed like a glamorous life into a dark story of betrayal, greed, and loss. Decades later, Barbara Cogan's name still lingers. In infamy, a chilling reminder of how far someone might go when love turns cold and money becomes the ultimate prize.